Okay, then I'm just slowly going to get started here. Welcome to this week's webinar, this week's Flourish webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you will find it useful. Today's topic will be on pie, column, and bar charts. And with me in the background are my colleagues, Richard, Elias, and Lindsay, who will be here to answer any questions that you might have. Feel free to ask those questions via the chat at any point. We will also be able to get back to you after today's webinar via priority support at flourish.studio if there are any questions that we might not be able to touch on during the session. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen and prepare my slides and get started with those. As I mentioned, today's topic are bar, column, and pie charts. And I'm going to get started first, though, with just a quick development from our side, some news on a new template type, a new visualization type that we now support, and point you towards our blog where you can learn all about it. Specifically, the new visualization technique is the stream graph, which is a variation of a stacked area chart. You can see the difference here and learn lots more about this type of visualization and how you might want to use it for your use cases in this blog post. We will be sharing these slides after the session on our designated training page, which you can find at flourish.studio/training. So you'll be able to access everything that I'm showing today from there after the session as well. So to get started, I'm going to dive straight into the topic of pie charts. And let me just go into full screen present here. Great. So we're going to start by looking at pie charts. Pie charts are quite a popular type of visualization. We see them a lot all around the place. They work well if you want to make the point that something is very big or very small. For example, in this example that we're showing over here, we might want to make the point that the part of coal that in this pie chart, which is showing the energy distribution of the energy that is produced in the UK, is quite small, then that might be a good point to make. However, it can also be a bit confusing if you have lots of different pieces, which is the case in this pie chart that we have here. For example, we can see that natural gas and petroleum are both quite large. We can probably also even make out that petroleum is the largest, but it's kind of difficult to see by how much and to make any nuanced decisions based on this chart. So I'm just quickly going to walk you through how I would create this one in Flourish, exit my full screen mode again, and then some considerations that you might want to make to make it a bit better. So the pie that we have here, just loading that up. One sec. There we go. Again, this is the same pie that we were just looking at, showing the UK energy distribution, and it's a bit difficult to see how much these different slices or segments are making up. So one of the things that you might want to do to improve that a little bit is to add labels, which you can do in the labels settings, and you can switch it to display the label, which we're currently doing, or to display the label. So that's going to show the value in the label, or to display both. So I'm just going to display both in this case. And now we have a bit of a clearer picture by how much petroleum is actually the biggest slice. Just quickly, I'm going to switch to the data tab. I forgot to do that when I got started here to show you what this looks like in the back end and how we would input the information there. This is just using some data that I downloaded from a government website of the UK, and it's showing the breakdown of fuel production in the UK across the years. And in this pie chart now, I've just selected 1 year to display as my pie, so 1995. I could also select several or a different year by changing the column binding here. So if I wanted to show 1996, I would just change it there. So now we're showing our labels on our pie chart, but that's still not great because you don't want to always have to label something specifically. That's kind of why you're using a chart. So it's still not a great chart at this point. So we're going to try and make some more changes to it. One of the changes that we might want to make as well is to move away from the pie chart in itself, because actually these angles that we see here make it even more difficult to read. They're all a little bit different, and our eye finds it hard to compare the sections with these angles because of that angle. So to get rid of the angle, we could actually move to a donut chart and change the size of the hole in the segment settings here. So I've just set it to be 50%, but you can also change that to anything else. I quite like it at 50, so I'm going to leave it like that. So that actually makes it a bit more like a bar chart, because it's you don't have to compare the different angles and kind of make that calculation in your brain anymore, which makes it a lot easier. Something else that you might want to do just while I'm in this pie chart, and I want to touch on the capability of adding animation and adding multiple series, which is something that I already mentioned just a minute ago. So if I want to switch back to the data tab here and display not only the year 1996 as a pie chart, but maybe all of these years, what I can do is just enter B through Z, and then I have 1995 through 2019. Now in the bottom right corner, I can already see Flourish is drawing lots of little pie charts, which might be fun in some cases, but this isn't exactly what I want to show you today. It's a bit much going on, and it would be very difficult to actually compare these different pies with each other. So what I want to do is I want to switch away from this grid of pie charts, which is what we call this, and go into a single pie chart. Now, currently, I'm only showing one series, and I don't even actually know which one that is. Oh, yes, it's 1995. If I hover, I can see that. But I want to make it run through time, which is something that you can actually do in Flourish. So to achieve that, I can go into the controls and filter settings, and I can say that I want to enable my series filter, and I want to set it to display as a timeline. We also have some other settings here like button groups or a drop down, but in this case, since we're actually looking at years, a timeline is a good choice. And now if I click play, it will actually run through those years and the pie will adjust. So that's a really fun thing that you can do in Flourish, something that just recently became available due to our new filter and control settings, which you can find here. And that can make for a really engaging so-called pie chart race. When you're creating a pie chart race like that, one consideration that you might want to make is to actually turn off the animations between series with the same name and the same label. So you can find those settings in the animation settings, because I'll just show you what it looks like when you don't do that. It's actually constantly trying to animate and update there. So we would just switch those off, and then it will nicely change between the sections. So that's how to create an animated pie chart in Flourish using our series filter settings. And yeah, we made a note here to untick those animation settings. As I mentioned, donuts are generally better than pies, but I'm still just going to go back to one more pie example before we move on to other better visualization techniques to use. And that is this kind of duo pie chart here. I'm just going to open this one in Flourish as well. In the data tab, this looks like this. I just deleted all the other series out here because I maybe want to compare 1995 to 2019. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a grid of charts again instead of a single chart, and I'm comparing 1995 to 2019. But again, this isn't really a good way to do that because it's kind of difficult to jump between the two pies, first of all. Also, the different slices have such different sizes that it's almost like they disappear in one pie and then reappear in the other, which makes it hard to see what's going on and which series it actually is. And also there's just so many different series, and we have the same issue with the angle going on. So this is not a good use of a pie chart, and I'm going to move on what to do instead in just a moment. But just before I do, I don't want to say that you should never use pie charts. There are some cases where you can use pie charts, and that is when you have less than 4 series. So ideally 2 or 3 series. I'm just going to remove some of these series by actually selecting them in the legend, because we're using the legend as a multi-deselect tool here, which you can actually configure in the legend settings. That would be here. You're saying that you want to have it as a multi-select. And now it actually, if I only have 2 or 3 different segments, it actually paints a much clearer picture. And this might be what I want to paint a picture of, which is that in 2019, the part of petroleum is actually much bigger in comparison to coal. So yeah, with fewer pieces, a pie chart can work, even when you're comparing them next to each other like this, but in general, we would advise not to. What we think you should do instead is actually to move away from the pie chart if you're trying to compare these different series, these energy types in this case. And you can do that actually by staying within the line bar pie template. As the name suggests, it has line, bar, and pie charts within this template, and actually just changing the chart type in the chart type settings. So here I'm going to change from pie and donut chart, and I'm just going to move into a bar chart. And now that's already a lot better because I get actually a much clearer picture how much makes up each year, like the distribution of the different energy types within a year. So using the baseline, I can actually read how much petroleum is or how much natural gas is in 2019 versus 1995. Now there's a few changes I might want to make when moving from pie to bar, and I'm going to walk through those now. One of them is the coloring. For example, you might want to color by row instead of by column. What that does is, just referring back to our data tab for a sec, it's now coloring by row, so one row at a time as I'm selecting them, instead of by column, because if I color by column, it will just color by year, basically. Another thing I might want to change is that I would probably want to get rid of the legend, as I'm actually labeling it quite clearly above the bars already. So to do that, I would just go into the legend settings, switch it off. And then my bars are quite thin and small at the moment. So to change that, I would go into the chart type settings and just change the value here, the bar size. And by making them better, I can already spot something else that I would want to change, which is that currently I'm actually displaying the label, the name of the series in the bar, but I'm also showing it on top of the bar. So we don't really need that information twice. And we're going to just configure that again using the label settings. If I scroll down to data point labels, which is what these are, I can switch it from label to value. So that might be a better thing to display in the bar at this point. There's also quite a few settings that you can make here regarding the alignment of your labels. So you might want to have it in the middle of your bar, or on the left, or even outside of the bar, so that they all can display, because currently we're actually hiding them when they're too small, which you can also switch off there. As you already saw, when I actually moved the label outside of the bar, the color of the label changed, and that's because we've selected the contrast mode here in our text color setting. We could also change it to be black in each case, but this is actually quite a nice setting and also a good one for accessibility, as it will automatically update based on the color of the background. So even if I were now to maybe update one of my colors to be a bit lighter, which I can do by just clicking into it and changing it here, either by changing the hex code or RGB code or by dragging, then you'll notice that the label contrast mode will actually come into play, and it will change from white to black based on the background color. So that's a good thing to know and to have selected if you don't want to have to worry about that yourself. That's also a relatively new addition and can make lots of people's lives a bit easier. So that's moving from a pie chart to a bar chart, which we did here. This makes it easy to compare the distribution within a single year. So as I mentioned, we can actually see petroleum is really big in 1995 and bioenergy and waste is quite small. But it's also possible to compare between the 2 years, but still not that easy. And to make that a bit easier, we actually have to bring our grid of charts onto the same chart so that they have the same baseline and we can compare the series at the same baseline, kind of read what the value is. So to do that, I'm just going to move from my grid of charts into a single chart again. So I'm going to go back into the chart type settings, select single chart. And now you can see it's displaying on a single chart, and it makes it actually easier to compare these two series. Again, I want to make some changes now though, because I'm currently coloring them both exactly the same. So I want to make a distinction between the 2 years. So to do that, again, I'm going to go to the color settings, select by column again. And now I need to make some kind of indication which color is what year. And I'm going to do that now by adding some text in the header. So I'm going to say 1995 versus 2019. And in the legend settings, I'm going to select auto in the add data colors to header text settings. So now you can see that I'm actually using the colors from my series in my title. So that's a nice thing to do to avoid using a legend, as legends are not always the best thing to use because it makes you kind of jump from your chart back up to the legend all the time instead of just comparing the series here. I would probably change the colors again. You can just drag your colors around within the palette, or as I did before, you can kind of change them there because that was a bit difficult to read. So now that makes it a lot easier to actually compare these series with each other. I'm just previewing it at different widths using the buttons in the top left corner. And so I can actually compare 1995 to 2019 a lot easier as they're using the same baseline. So that's what we did here. You can also compare both of the things that we just did within a Flourish story. And I'm going to show you how you could do that. So I'm just going to save this as group bar chart. And then I'm going to make a duplicate of that. And I'm going to call it grid of bar charts. And for my grid of bar charts, I'm going to switch back to the grid view. And I can now either click on create a story from here, or I can go to my home page and select new story and then choose a visualization for my first slide, for which I'm going to select my grouped bar chart. And then I'm going to choose a visualization for my second slide, for which I'm going to use my grid. So now I'm just going to show this in a new preview tab. I have my first slide, which is showing my grouped bars where I can actually compare the different years, and my second slide where I'm actually breaking them out so I can look at the distribution within those years in more detail if I want to do that. So that's where Flourish stories can really be quite powerful and help you tell your story and show different sides of your story and your data. Going back to my slides, there's a third view that you might want to consider when doing a story like that, or when showing the difference between two series, which is that, so here I'm just doing the grouped bars versus the grid of bars. And then the third one that we have here is actually the calculated difference between 1995 and 2019, as this might be even clearer. If that's really what you're focusing on in your story, and that's really the story that you want to tell, then this might be the clearest option. This was just created separately as a third visualization and was calculated before inputting it to Flourish. So here, if I look at the data tab, we just calculated the difference between these two and are displaying that as a single bar chart with negative values. Okay, moving on. From bar charts to column charts. A column chart is basically the same as a bar chart, except that it's vertical, so from bottom to top or from top to bottom, instead of from left to right or right to left. It's similarly well legible though. Our eyes like both of bar and column charts because it's easy to compare the heights. Sorry, I was just looking for my example. I'll just open a new one. So in this case, we're actually using the exact same data, but we just switched it from bar chart to column chart in the chart type drop down here. So I'll just show you that process. We moved from this version, which is what we had a minute ago, to column chart. Now this, actually I do want to quickly show you the settings that you might want to change when doing that change. So if I select column chart here, then you already see our labels have now been moved into the x-axis, and you might want to make some changes to the way that they display. To do that, I would go into the x-axis settings, into the tick and label settings, and then you can change maybe the angle of the text. That might look a bit better. I would change the color probably, make it a bit more legible, and maybe make them a bit bigger as well so that it's clear what these different categories are. And then what's important though, when you're using a column chart like this, is to actually preview it on mobile, because there are a few considerations that you have to make when you're using this type of chart that you wouldn't have to make in a bar chart, which you can already see it happening. Our labels are disappearing as we change our screen size. So to avoid that, we like to recommend actually keeping a slight angle. We now also support line breaks in labels that should break automatically after a certain length. But in general, you should probably consider using a bar chart when you have very long category names. So looking at this example, we have very long category names, and it looks a bit messy when I'm using it as a column chart. But then when I switch to the bar chart, this actually works quite well. So those are just some considerations to make there. We don't really see a difference between bar or column charts in terms of legibility or one being better understandable than the other. It's kind of just a question of taste and yeah, personal preference. Just in case it wasn't clear and I was moving too quickly, I was using these buttons here in the top left corner to preview my visualization on mobile. You can always just select the typical tablet width, the typical mobile width, or enter a custom size if you might have a certain container size at which you would be displaying your visualization. You can just do that there. Okay. One rule before I move on to stacked column charts, which refers to the baseline of column and bar charts, and that is that you always have to have a zero baseline. That is very important, and there are no exceptions. If we look at the example over here, our chart is actually comparing the values, and it's a bit difficult to see because it's quite small, but it's comparing 35 to 39. So if we look at that in Flourish, this is 35 and this is 39, and the difference, it's definitely noticeable, but so it would actually be fine to show this, but it's just not as dramatic as they're showing here. And that's because we're actually skewing the visualization. It's difficult to compare these heights if you're actually taking away the zero. You're taking away that context as to what comes before this. And so you're not allowed to do that. You can't compare it like that. That is misrepresenting the data. You could use a line chart if you didn't want your baseline to start from zero. That's a different story. It's okay to use a non-zero baseline there. Also not necessarily best practice, but it could work because you would be comparing kind of the trajectory of the lines to each other instead of to the zero baseline, which has to be done here with the height of the bar and the column. So yeah, that is non-negotiable. Moving on to stacked column charts. This is a nice way to compare totals across different categories and also look at a breakdown within a given category at the same time. So if we look at our example here, we've created a stacked column chart. This is using, again, the same data that we had before, but we have now all the years from 1995 to 2019 again, and we've actually, I think, swapped our columns and rows. When we were using the pie chart, we had it like this, so we used this little transpose button, but in the stacked column chart, we're displaying it with a series in each column, like so. And we're just stacking each kind of part on top of each other of each year. So this is a nice way to kind of see the trajectory, the trend of the data going down and then slightly back up again over the years. But at the same time, it's a nice way to see the breakdown. So I can kind of notice which categories are kind of becoming less over the years, but it's not that easy to be fair. Especially because you can't kind of always refer back to the baseline over here as easily. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult to read, but it can still be quite an impactful visualization. This, by the way, I just selected again from the column chart stacked option in the chart type settings. And this is another one where it's a good case for a Flourish story because you can actually break this into a grid of charts and kind of look at each of these series themselves and compare the year to the year before it a bit more easily, and also, yeah, kind of just dive into each series and see its trend more upfront. So to create a story there, I would just, again, I would use my stacked column chart kind of one, then I would duplicate that, create a grid of charts version of that. I can also maybe decide if I want to make some changes to the way my grid of charts displays. Either I leave it at auto number of columns, then it will always default to the number of columns that works best for the screen size that it's currently being displayed on. So if I display it on a tablet, it will show 3 and 3. If I switch to a mobile, it will do 2 and 2. But I can also change that number of columns if I switch over to fixed, and then I can maybe make it 1 if I always want to only show 1 series on each kind of line of my grid. So there's a few different options there. You can also customize things like the axes, if they should stay the same across the grid, and the titles. I'm just going to leave it at auto for now and create my story. So to create my story this time, I'm just going to go through the create a story button in the editor. And I'm going to grab my first slide by just selecting new slide, and then I'm going to select it. And I'm going to put this one in first place. Did that work? Yeah, I think so. And so here we have another nice example of kind of looking at the full picture with our stacked bar chart, stacked column chart, sorry. We can see the trend of it going down. And then if we switch to the next slide, we can actually see each and every category of energy broken down into its own little grid so that it's easier to look at from there. And I can really see the trend of bioenergy and waste going up, for example, or how petroleum really went down and then back up again as well, which is visible here, but just not as well visible. So it really always depends on the story that you're trying to tell and what you're trying to focus on. Okay. Finally, the stacked percentage column chart. This is another variation of the stacked column chart. You can get to this one. I'm just going to go back into the stacked column chart that we just used, and I'm just going to select column chart stacked percentage instead of stacked. And then it will always show it proportionally. So you can actually see the relative shift in composition instead of the overall trend. Now we're looking at the kind of build up over the years in proportions. So again, it really depends on what your story is, but in this case, it becomes kind of even more clear to me that bioenergy and waste is becoming a larger part of the energy mix in proportion to everything else. Whereas in our view that we had here, we can see that it's building up, but it's still quite small. And here it actually seems to make quite a significant increase. And finally, this is my last slide of today's tea break. You might want to highlight something like that by adding the different visualizations to a story. So in this case, I am telling exactly that story of the bioenergy and waste kind of picking up. So here I can see that it's increasing, but also not that well, but I can see it kind of in comparison to everything else. Here I can, again, see that it's increasing, but it looks quite small. And then here I can actually look at it in proportion to everything else. The way that I achieved this, I'm just going to quickly go into the app so I can show you, is by using custom coloring. So I decided that I wanted to focus on bioenergy and waste. I used the legend coloring, which we already looked at earlier. So that part was done in the legend add data colors to header text, set to auto. And then in the colors, I chose to have this gray palette. And then I just made bioenergy and waste appear in red with this custom override. And then I used the same palette and the same override in all of these 3 slides, so that my bioenergy and waste kind of always jumps out. Okay, that is all for today. I think we are exactly at 3:30, so well in time. I hope that was useful to everyone. Thank you again for coming along. Please let me know if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for future sessions. We will be uploading a recording of this session to our designated YouTube channel, and you should be getting an email on that if you've registered for this webinar. And yeah, I wish you all a wonderful day and look forward to seeing what you create with Flourish in the future. Goodbye, everyone.